Hi, everyone. I hope that you can see me. I think we're going to get started. I gather that people will slowly trickle in the next maybe 5 to 10 minutes or so. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. A big thank you from Saba, BC. I'm Raminder. I'm a director and the secretary of the South Asian Bar Association for this year. As mentioned in the email blast, this is CPD pending. When we get the 1 hour CPD approval, we will hopefully get it, first of all. Second of all, we'll email you when we have more information on that. On top of that, in the email, we stated that this will be recorded. We can't see any of you or hear any of you, but generally, if you want to pass this information on to others, if you found this helpful, which I'm sure you will, given Dr. Saira's experience, you can direct people to our website once we have it up there, and we'll let you know when that is. A little bit of a background for Dr. Saira. I'm very excited to have Dr. Saira on to speak about professional burnout. I think we met online in 2018, and so it's been a couple of years, and we were going back and forth about doing something to, promote a wellness event or burnout related topic. And it seems that it was just timed perfectly to do this now. And again, thank you to Dr. Saira for doing this. Dr. Saira is an instructor at Stenberg. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Queen's in Psychology and Sociology, a Master's of Art in Psychology, as well as a PhD in Transpersonal Psychology. Her PhD dissertation involved research on mother-daughter relationships in the Indo-Canadian context, so very much linked to Saba, BC. And I'll read her bio that we sent out to you. Dr. Saira Sabzaali works with adults from diverse cultural backgrounds who are looking for a new approach to mental health and want to incorporate their cultural values and spiritual beliefs into therapy. She specializes in depression, anxiety, burnout, and family harmony. She also runs support groups for women and newlyweds, has a free podcast called Sabzaali, Sabzi, and provides teaching videos through Dragon Wellness TV on YouTube. She's also delivered 2 TED Talks. And so very excited to have her on. Before we actually start, I wanted to just give a quick shout out to CBABC, Saba North America, and Saba Toronto for helping us promote this event. On top of that, if you want to give or if you want to ask questions for Dr. Saira, you'll be able to do that at the end. But generally, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom platform. During the webinar, you can just submit the questions and I'll be filtering through them. So that way, whatever comes up, I can ask Dr. Saira and then just eliminate the questions that are duplicates. Also, Dr. Saira has requested that we keep the chat function open as she may ask some interactive questions. And so, in order to keep you all engaged, you're able to kind of type away your answers. And so I don't think that I've missed anything. Dr. Saira, I'm going to pass it over to you and turn my video off. So yes, thank you again.
Hello everyone. I hope you can see me. If you can't, then you want to go up into the corner and make sure you can see your active speaker video thumbnail, something like that. So make sure you can see me. I want to make sure that this is an interactive event, because if we were in person, we'd be all in a room together and I would be asking you questions and you'd be putting up your hand or you'd be looking bored or whatever, and I can't see you and I don't know who's here. And so what I'd love to start with is just a little quick hello from me. I'm a transpersonal psychotherapist, and transpersonal is the intersection point between psychology and spiritual beliefs. So whatever that looks like for different people. While I do everything that a regular therapist would do, there's always that underlying story of, and what's the bigger lesson here? What's the soul journey here? So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. If you can go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that bar, and there's a button there that says more. If you click on more, you'll come up with the chat box. And so we're going to be doing some chatting today. And so if you could please type into the chat box how many years you've been in the field. So just type it in, just the number. So just do that right now. So I know who's in the room, how many years you've been in the field, just so I can frame the content according to how long you've been working as a lawyer for. So just do that now. I'll take a moment while you do that. Hopefully you can type. Or maybe you can't type in the chat box. Oh, maybe only we can type. That would suck. Maybe if I ask you a question. I say how many years? Okay, maybe you cannot type in the chat box, but maybe the Q&A Chat. Okay. So let's just do that in the Q&A box then for a minute. If you can type in the Q&A box, how many years have you been in the field? So just type that in. 20, 18, 8, 1, 11, 5, 5, 12, 7. So we have some new people. We have some really, really seasoned people. We have summer students, a couple summer students, new recent grads, 16, 20, 45 years. Great. So we have a big variety. We have lots of different people from a whole range. And I'm glad we're using the Q&A box because now you know how to use it. And so as we're going along, if you have questions, if something doesn't make sense to you, please put it into the Q&A box. And then that way at the end, when we have a chance for questions, we won't be like waiting around for your questions. So just type that in there. So now you know how to use the Q&A box. We will close that out and let's get started. So this is our presentation on professional burnout. I picked this picture specifically for you, my lawyer friends, because you have to listen to people's problems, just like me. And when you're burnt out, it's hard to pay attention to people's problems. And it can feel like, oh my goodness, one more client, I just cannot deal with one more person. And I'm not sure if you're dealing more with the paperwork side of things or the face-to-face side of things, but either way, it can just feel like work becomes very tedious when you're burnt out. And so we want to talk about how to get around, well, first of all, why that happens, and then how to get around that. So let's begin with what is mental health? You know, when I say the words mental health, what kind of words come to your mind? Probably something like depression, anxiety, maybe schizophrenia, maybe addiction, maybe medication, therapy. These are some of the words that people associate when they hear the words mental health. But I want to tell you that what those words are actually affiliated with mental illness. Okay, so there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. All of us have mental health, right? Just like all of us have physical health, all of us have mental health. Not all of us have mental illness. And even those of us who do have a mental illness can be more well or more unwell depending on, our life circumstances. So I just want to make sure that we're all using the same kind of terminology, which I know is very important to lawyers. So I want to put that right up front. What is mental health? Every one of us has mental health, regardless of whether or not we have a mental illness. And the statistics are 1 in 5 Canadians will at some point in their life 1 in 5 Canadians right now is living with a mental illness. And over the course of a lifespan, 1 in 2 of us will experience some sort of severe mental health distress. And so that might not be a diagnosed condition, but something where you're just really not in a good space. So it's important that all of us know about it for ourselves, but also for our loved ones. And so as you're listening to this presentation, think about yourself and how it applies to you, but also think about your own loved ones, the people in your household, the people in your family system who might be able to benefit from some of this content, and then you can just pass it on. So the World Health Organization gives this definition of mental health. They say mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, that's a really big definition of mental health, right? It's not just an absence of an illness, okay? It's being able to cope, being able to work productively and fruitfully, realizing your potential, making a contribution. So many of us right now are experiencing poor mental health, right? Many of us are having a hard time working productively and fruitfully or coping with the normal stressors of life, not feeling like we're able to make a contribution, right? So it's important that we know that mental illness is a diagnosed clinical condition. So what stresses us out? Now, this is a census that was taken in 2010, so 10 years ago. They haven't done it again. They haven't updated it. But 10 years ago, when they polled Canadians, this is the Canadian census, they looked at what was stressing people out. And so the question was, what's your number one source of stress? And 62% of people said work was their number one source of stress. Work was their number one source of stress. And if you look at the other numbers here, so finances, 12% of people said finances were their source of stress, but the bulk of that group, I think it was over 80% of that group, were living under the low-income cutoff. Okay, so people who were living under the LICO were actually most stressed about finances. Time, 12% of people said that time was their number one stressor. And the people who said that time was their number one stressor were people who were newly into the workforce. Okay, so newly into the workforce, finding time a bit of too much pressure. 8% of people said family was their number one stressor. And from that 8%, from that group, the majority of those people were working parents, specifically working mothers. So that's family. And then personal, that was 6%. And the bulk of those people were young professionals who were just kind of hustling, right? So time, finances, family, personal, is less than work. And now if you think about what's happening for us right now is that we're home. Many of us are working from home. And so we have the personal stressors in our environment. You might have the family stressors in our environment. So a majority of what's happening in our environment can be stressful according to Stats Canada and what stresses us out. So just something to think about there. Now, in work, I would also add anything that you might not even be getting paid for, but that you do for a passion, like volunteering, right? So like right now for me, I'm at work. I might not be getting paid for this, but this is work for me. I don't find it stressful, luckily, but there are times when I'm not doing well, when work can feel really stressful. And when we're in the business of helping other people, we have to make sure our own tank is full. And that's why this presentation, I think, is so important for this cohort, because you're in the business of helping people. Right? You're in the business of helping people. And if you don't feel okay, it's really hard to help other people. And so I want you to look at these pictures here. So look through the pictures. Maybe we can start at the left side. So you're seeing that there's a difference between coping and thriving. Okay, there's a difference between coping, just getting by, and thriving. And during COVID-19, many of us have been simply coping. Just coping. And when you look at coping, what does that look like? Well, it can look like headaches. It can look like sleeplessness. It can look like crying, tears, sadness. It can look like frustration. It can look like hair loss and other physical symptoms. These are some of the things that happen when we're just coping, when we're just kind of surviving. And you'll notice in the two corners, this bottom corner on the left here and the top corner on the right, there's conversation, right? And what actually helps us get out of coping is social contact. So I want to tell you a little bit of science. Here's our Neuroscience 101 portion of the presentation. So there are different aspects, different elements in the brain. There's different like kind of working modes, if you will, of the brain. And so one of the working modes of the brain is what we call the social engagement mode. And so that's the mode where our cortex, the newest part of the brain, is activated and energized. And there's like things are happening there. And that's the part of the brain that I call the captain, right? It's like can do long-term planning, goal setting, can see the horizon, can make good decisions, can say the right things. It's when you just feel like you're in the flow and you don't have to work very hard and the right words are coming out of your mouth and you're calm and you're collected. That's the captain mode of the brain. Then there's another mode. There's actually two other kind of aspects of the brain that I want to talk about. So one is called the limbic system, what I like to call the first mate. And then the other one is called the reptilian brain, or we call it the sheriff. So I'll use those terms to make it a little less technical. Okay, so captain, first mate, and sheriff. So the captain, that's the part of your brain, remember? Steering the ship. The first mate is the part of the brain that's always scanning for danger, scanning, looking. The waves are coming, the sharks are coming. That's the part of the brain. And that part of the brain is actually very strong because that's the part of the brain that's kept us alive for generations, right? And so that's the part that's scanning. So if in the olden days when we lived outside and there were tigers, you'd get activated and then because there'd be a sound like, oh, something's wrong, you'd be alerted, and then you're watching for the tiger. And when the tiger comes, you can either fight the tiger, if it's a baby one. If it's too big, you're going to run away, so that's flight, fight, flight. Or if the tiger catches you, you're going to freeze. You're going to play dead. That's what the body just does that. You don't have a choice in that matter, okay? So fight, flight, or freeze. So those directions are given by the first mate to the sheriff. So if the first mate sees danger, he makes a choice. Am I going to pass this information to the captain or am I going to pass this information to the sheriff? If he passes it to the sheriff, you're just trying to stay alive now. This is why we often, when we're in an argument with someone, we say things that we would never otherwise say. And the reason for that is because that's the fight, right? That's the modern day equivalent of fighting the tiger, is saying those things to push the person away. And that's when we're in sheriff mode. So how does this relate to us right now in the work environment? Well, for 4 months, many of us have been in this hyper-vigilant kind of mode. And for many, many, many people, our brains have been more in the first mate and sheriff mode than in the captain mode. And so it's harder to think straight. It's harder to make good decisions when we're in that other brain mode. It's just harder to do, right? So many of us, the things that we would normally do to feel better, we don't even think about doing them because we're not feeling good. And this is not something you can just think your way out of. It's biology, right? So the way through all of that, the way that we can get back into our social engagement mode, back into our captain, is to connect with another human being that's safe, that's emotionally safe for us. For some of us, that's not the people in our household. It's not. For some of us it is, and thank goodness. But for others, it's not the people in our household. And so if you're surrounded day in and day out with people who are not emotionally safe for you, well, then you're going to get really, really drained and not have a way to fill your tank. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today is if you're not living in necessarily the ideal emotional environment at home, well, what do you do then to keep going and not get so tired through the work process? I wish you were in the room because then I would say, any questions? So if you have any questions as we're going along, remember, type it into the Q&A box and then we can address it at the end. So before we dive in, I want you to be able to hold on to something, okay? Because we're going to kind of go on a bit of a journey here. So the thing that brings us back to ourselves is different for each one of us. And so I wanted you to think about what is it that motivates you? For some people, what motivates us is actually the accolades, right? The successes, the achievements, the busyness, the getting things done, the winning the client, whatever it is. And that's what motivates some of us. It's actually what drives us and makes us feel good. See, motivation is rewarded with a hormone called dopamine. So there's this hormone that floods the brain. It's called dopamine, and it makes you feel like, oh yeah, I did that, right? It makes you feel like you achieved something. And for each one of us, different things are going to trigger dopamine. There's some things that will trigger dopamine in everyone, such as rigorous physical exercise. Everybody gets dopamine out of that. Catching a ball, everybody gets dopamine out of that. So there's little things, little moments where you can get these spurts. But there's other big doses that come from different activities for different people. For some people, what motivates them is the people they love, right? Being there, providing, connecting, that's what motivates them. For some people, what motivates them is beauty, right? Beauty, creativity, that's what motivates them. For some people, it's achieving some sort of impossible goal, right? Like climbing that mountain, whether it's a literal mountain or metaphorically. And there's other things. These are just some examples of what might motivate someone. And so just take a moment now and think about what is it if you think back before COVID-19, what was it that motivated you? Right? Before the world exploded into, protests, what was it that motivated you? And what you're likely going to find is that what motivated you then doesn't fit in this context. It actually doesn't fit in our new context. We have to find new things that motivate us. And so for some people, it might just be my motivation is getting to 12 o'clock so I can drink that cup of coffee that I've been waiting for. And that's what it is. That's all I can think of to motivate myself. For some of us, it may be, getting through the work week. So on Saturday, I can have that social distance visit with my whoever, right? It might be like that right now. It might not be these more deeper motivations. It might just be managing and getting to the next point. And that's totally okay. That's totally okay to have those mini goalposts to be able to motivate ourselves. So what is burnout? What is burnout? Burnout is a state of chronic stress, and it leads to physical and emotional exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, and feelings of ineffectiveness or lack of accomplishment, right? And that's why that first picture, because it's like you just don't feel like you're achieving anything. You don't feel like there's a point in trying to achieve anything. You're exhausted, you're cynical, and you just feel kind of numb and detached. That's what burnout looks like. Now, I want to talk to you for a second about stress. Our system is designed to process stress. We were designed for that. The problem is in our current reality, the stress is going on for too long and at too high of an intensity. So remember that example I gave you earlier of the tiger, right? We see the tiger, we run from the tiger, and then the body will just kind of get back to normal. It'll get back to homeostasis. That's how it's supposed to be. But what's happening now, if you think about our life, back before we were in our homes all day, we would be, say, driving in traffic, for example, right? Getting cut off by someone in traffic gives you the same physiological reaction as seeing the tiger. The brain doesn't know that that's not a tiger. It'll do the same thing in your body. But instead of running like you would, running away from the tiger and burning up that extra adrenaline, cortisol, all of those things that are in you, you just have to sit there in your car and continue to drive. So there's no movement, there's no body movement to complete what we call complete the stress cycle, right? And so we're hitting this stress point over and over and over and over and over throughout our days. And so we're not able to complete. Do you remember, and this has happened for, and maybe not for you, but for most of the people I've been talking to as far as my clients, the first week or 2 or 3 of this COVID-19 thing, people actually felt a bit of relaxation. They felt like, oh, I have all this time. People were emptying out their cupboards. They were rearranging their furniture. They were learning how to cook things. Like all of a sudden we had all this time. And so that's because our normal changed significantly, right? And so all of that stress that was piling up, finally we had a little bit of a vacation from it, right? A little bit of a break from it. Now we're on the other side, right? Where now we've had this, 3.5, 4 months of intense home time, where for lawyers especially, it hasn't necessarily been quieter. Maybe for some, but for many in your profession, it will have been more intense because now you're expected to do that work, but in a home environment. See, the problem is we don't, in our regular life before all this, we were able to go to certain spaces and places and behave in certain ways. Okay, so right now what's happening is basically you are in the same place, you are so you're at the office, you're at the water cooler at the office, but you're also in the boardroom at the office, and you're also meeting with a client at the office, and you're also, attending to children, and you're also watching a movie, and you're also, like, there's just too many things happening in the same location. And that's not what we're used to, right? We're used to going to the movie theater to watch a movie, and maybe going out to a restaurant to meet friends instead of seeing them on our Zoom screen, and going to a location at the office. And there's even in our office spaces, right? There's different rooms for different things. Right now, we're all just staring at a computer screen all the time. And so we're not used to that. It's really been hard on us, and it's increasing our stress. And so burnout happens when you just can't take that intensity of stress any longer, and you just basically say, enough is enough. The system just kind of shuts down, right? So you're exhausted, and the cynicism and detachment is the emotional response to just too much intense stimulation that goes on and on and on and on. So that's what burnout is. I wanted to show you this model that I designed with a colleague of mine who's a project manager. And we were talking to people who were really, really passionate about their work or were volunteers, right? So they love what they do so much that they're willing to do it without getting paid, right? I mean, the paycheck helps and we feel good about getting the money, but you're ready to do this work. So when you're passionate about your work, it's easier to actually get burnt out, believe it or not. So here's what we've discovered, that usually people start a project when they're inspired, right? You start something new, you have an idea to do something and you're inspired, and then it feels good. It's like this inspiration comes from somewhere, it feels good. And then you start getting busy, right? You start getting busy, you're doing this thing. As you do this thing, often you get more opportunities because people start noticing you that, oh, like, look at this person. They're really into this. They're really moving forward. They have these great ideas, and you get more opportunities and you get busier and busier. And it leads to a feeling of fulfillment where you just feel good. Like, oh, that really feels good. Now, usually at fulfillment, what happens is people feel so good that they're willing to take on more, right? They're like, yeah, bring it on. This feels so good. But what happens if we just do that without refilling our tank at that point is that we begin to get tired. Because when we started, our capacity was this much, okay? And our problems or the demands on us were this much. But as we grow into our profession, into our families, into our volunteer opportunities, the demands become this much. But remember, our capacity is still only this much. And so if we don't do something, we call it in the field, if we don't do something to expand the container, we will feel overwhelmed and we'll get tired, right? And once we get tired, then we get to the point of it just feels like too much. And that's the burnout where I can't do it anymore. Most people don't really do anything differently until they're at that tired or too much state. But by then it's kind of too late because now you have to backpedal and you have to do a lot of repair work. And so my colleague and I said, okay, well, instead of going that way, what if we did it a different way? And so we looked at people who didn't get tired. We looked at people who didn't get tired and what were they doing? And what we found is that what they did was that when they felt fulfilled, when they felt that feeling of fulfillment, one, that they expressed gratitude, and two, they rededicated to whatever it was they were doing and they expanded their capacity. They brought in people to help them. They brought in systems, whatever it was, they expanded. So they chose again and they went bigger instead of being like, oh, this is good. I can just do more with the container that I have. And that's what moves us into leadership, right? When we're able to actually expand. Remember to type in your questions as we're going, if you have any as I'm speaking. So what's the solution to burnout? Because is people. What's the solution? When your physiological system is depleted, the only way you can get back to okay is to be around another human who's okay. So there's something in the brain called brain and body called mirror neurons. Mirror, like a mirror that you look at, right? And so what we do and babies have lots of them. So what happens with mirror neurons is that I look at you and I start to attune myself. My voice starts matching yours. My posture starts matching yours. The speed or the slowness of my cadence starts matching yours. That's just something naturally that we do as social mammals. We're just designed that way. And so when you're around someone else who's feeling good, your body will just naturally start to line up with it. Have you ever noticed that sometimes when a particular person walks into the room, everyone just feels like good? And when a different person walks into the room, it's like, oh no, right? Because we resonate. We actually, our bodies line up to each other. Our physiological systems, our nervous systems line up to each other. And so when we're in the same room, and that's the problem with the Zoom thing, right? Is that, you can see me, but you can't feel me, right? You can't, there's actually pheromones that we let off, these like invisible smells that we let off that tell each other that we're safe. And you don't get that through a Zoom screen. And so many of us are really craving and missing that real, meaningful human contact. You might be getting it in your house, which is amazing, but you might not. Right? And so the solution is to get physically around other people and touch. Oh my goodness. Mental health professionals are like we're writing our letters because we know how important touch is for mental well-being. We know this. There's so much research on it. And right now we're having a hard time touching people because of, transmitting the virus. And so it's not surprising that so many people are depleted because we're not getting the things that we would naturally get. And people say, oh, I'm an extrovert, I'm an introvert. But the thing that we've learned during this pandemic is even the introverts need people. They might do it in a little bit of a different way. They might go sit at a coffee shop and do their work, or they might, pop in on something just for less time. But even the introverts need that physical closeness. And so, as the rules start being sent down about how many people we can have, whatever, get around people you can touch. Simple as that. People you trust, people who have that like steady vibe. And if you can't touch them right now, well, get on the phone with them, listen to their voice at least, because your body will start to align when you can hear that there's something in the tones of voice that also soften us, right? So that's the solution to burnout is people. I actually did, my second TEDx talk was called People Matter More Than Things. And in there I talk about a little bit of the science of being social mammals and why people are basically the solution. There's a concept in psychology called attachment theory. And in attachment theory, they look at our basic needs, right? And so when you think about, okay, what are our basic needs? Food, water, clothing, like that's what we think of, shelter. But now what we know is that even more than those is attachment to a responsible human. So when a baby is born, it might not have food, clothing, shelter, whatever, but if it's attached to a responsible, caring adult, that baby will survive. Somehow that adult will ensure that baby survives. This is healthy, responsible adult, right? So attachment, bonding is our number one need. which is why so many of us are depleted right now, because we haven't had that, and maybe we haven't been able to have that. Now's the time to get more deliberate about finding that connecting point. And I mean, people in your home may be that person and they may not be. If they're not that person, you need to look outside. One of the things I often say to my clients is that, we can't change other people. We can change ourselves. We can't stop other people from saying what they say. But what we can do is shrink our own buttons, right? We can't stop them from pressing our buttons. My job is to shrink that button so they can't see it so clearly. So we can change here. We can't, and you know this as lawyers, right? You totally know this, that there's only so much you can do for other people. They have to do a lot for themselves. So I want to share this video with you. It's by Brene Brown. And if you haven't heard of her, she's a writer who talks about, she's a researcher, social science researcher, and she researches shame. And one of her books, I think, is an excellent read for A-type personalities, which are probably most of the people on this call who like things, a particular way, really hardworking, really driven. It's called The Gifts of Imperfection. Tiny little read. It's a really worthwhile read, The Gifts of Imperfection. In this video, she's actually talking about empathy. How do we actually connect to other people? Because part of this is like, I'm telling you this, and hopefully what I'm hoping will happen is that you'll go and then implement these things with the people in your home. You'll be the one who's that steady soft landing point for other people, right? And so one of the ways to be that steady soft landing point is to be able to relate to people when they're going through difficulties. So for a moment, I'm going to ask you to just take off your lawyer hat, because lawyers are there to often solve problems, right? But I'm not talking about problem solving. I'm talking about being with a person. So apply this to, again, your friend circle, your family group, not necessarily your clients, because that's a different role, but specifically, your loved ones. So it's about 2 minutes. I'm just going to start it now.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I want to show you this. This is the mental health continuum, and it was designed by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and it was particularly designed to speak to first responders. There's a lot of stigma in the realm of first responders around mental health and seeing the shrink, right? And so what they wanted to talk about is, well, let's look at mental health not as a yes, you're ill or no, you're not ill, but let's look at the continuum of mental health in general. Remember, mental health is different than mental illness. And so they developed this continuum model. And so if you look here on the left side, you'll see that there's certain there's certain things that we do that demonstrate that we're in a healthy mental space. So we'll have our normal fluctuations in mood, our sleep patterns, we'll feel well, we'll have energy, we'll have this consistent performance, we'll be active socially. And that's when we're feeling good, right? Many of us have green days, and that's how we want to feel. For a lot of us during COVID-19, we've been in the yellow, and the yellow is where we're kind of in that reacting space. And so we're nervous, we're irritable, sad, maybe some trouble sleeping, feeling tired, low energy, muscle tension and headaches. Remember the physical symptoms? Maybe we're procrastinating. We've had decreased social activity without our choice. And so when we're in this space, we want to make sure that we're recognizing our limits, we're getting rest, food, and exercise, engaging in healthy coping, and trying to minimize our stressors. Some of us have actually moved into orange or red, and this is where things are getting a little bit more serious. So burnout happens in about orange to red, and that's when you're angry, you're hopeless, you're really having restless sleep or disturbed sleep. You have these chronic like fatigues and aches and pains. You have something called presenteeism. So you're showing up for work, but you're not really there. And you're actually starting to avoid people. This is where we want to seek social support. We want to seek help. We want to talk to someone about what's going on, right? Connection is the answer. And then the red. And the red is, and the thing is, and what they're trying to show with this model is don't wait till it gets to the red, right? You can watch the signs in yourself and your loved ones to see when they're moving that way, and then do things to get to the green. And I'll talk about what you do to get to the green right after this. So the red is where you're maybe enraged, like getting angry really easily, or you're really depressed, sleep is just becoming impossible, you're exhausted, you're actually not able to show up for work. And this is where we actually want to get a healthcare professional, a mental health professional involved. And so I think this is a really important model because it helps you to look after each other, right? Because I might not know that I'm in the yellow or the orange, but my colleague who I meet with on a regular basis might notice that, oh, like you look a little down today, right? They might notice that I'm moving. I might not know that I'm, on the verge, but maybe my kids will say, my kids do this all the time. They're like, Mama, are you okay? And then I have to check in with myself, like, am I okay? Oh yeah, they're onto something. I'm actually quite grumpy right now, right? So this continuum is not just for you to apply to yourself, but for you to apply to those loved ones in your own life as well. And then I started this part of it with that empathy clip because it's not about making things better or solving their problems. It's about being there and being able to hold the discomfort. And so if we can do that for each other as colleagues in the field, well then, we've fought half the battle already. So how do we do that? How do we, what I call CARE? So this is a little acronym that I came up with. Connection, authenticity, responsiveness, and excellence. So connection is the first thing, right? We have to be willing to connect with another. First connect with ourselves. So really be like clear, like honest and curious about what's actually going on for me and connect to the self, and then be willing to connect with the other. I would say for many of us who are steeped in spiritual practices, also connect with the higher, whatever that means to you, whether that's nature, whether that's a higher power, whatever that is. So connection is first. Next is authenticity. Be real. You don't always have to be okay. If you're always okay, you're a sociopath. Like you should not be okay right now. There's a lot of things happening in the world. So be real about what you're going through. And you don't have to be like a complainer and like an Eeyore, but be honest about, I'm having a bit of a rough week, or these last couple of days have been really heavy for me. Be authentic. Responsiveness. Now, responsiveness is different than responsibility. Responsibility is it's like these loads that we get, that we have to carry. So like I'm responsible for my kids' well-being, and I'm responsible for my clients, and I'm responsible for my own physical health and well-being, and I'm responsible for my mom, and I'm responsible for my dad. It's like all these things just like weighing me down. Whereas responsiveness is about responding to the need at hand, the person who's in front of me. And so my child needs something and I respond, and it's more like a dance, right? And somebody else needs something and I respond over here, and somebody else, and I keep moving, and I don't get bogged down with the heaviness of that responsibility. And then finally, excellence, right? You're not in this profession because you wanted to be mediocre. Like, you had to work hard to get here. And why not apply that same excellence to your social relationships, right? To the people that mean something to you. So that's how we care. What is self-care? Self-care is about turning that on, looking back inside ourselves. And there's a couple of things I want to say before we move into Q&A about self-care. And so one of them is being able to set boundaries, to be able to say no. To be able to say no when you mean it and yes when you mean it. Have you ever had someone say yes to you, but they mean no, right? They're like, can you do this? And they're like, yeah. How does that make you feel? Awful, right? It's better if they had just said no in a kind way. And so it's important that we're able to set those boundaries. And right now, it's more important than ever to be able to set boundaries. You may have to take on less tasks at work. You may have to tell your, employers, whoever's on the call, but you might have to say no to certain things that you're being asked to do, because your health and well-being is the first thing that matters in general in life, but especially right now. And so you're going to have to be able to learn how to say no. And it can be in a compassionate way. One of the things about saying no is you don't have to give a reason. So somebody asks you to do something. Oh, actually, that's not going to work out for me right now. You don't have to say why. You don't have to give excuses. Just say, oh, no, thank you. I'd rather not do that right now. Here's another, I think this happened with, I think that happened with this workshop, where a couple of years ago when I was asked to do it, I had to say, no, I'm not able to do it. But here's a couple of other speakers that I could recommend, right? So being able to say no is really, really critical. Focusing on our own balance wheel. So there's these 6 areas. And if you're in balance in these 6 areas, you generally feel good. And so those are emotional, physical, community, creative, spiritual, and intellectual. If you have equal amounts of time and energy in each of these areas, we tend to feel good. And so what you might want to do, and what I have my clients do sometimes, is I have them actually draw their own little balance wheel, right? And do the dimensions, how much time and energy are you spending on each one of these? And if you're spending a little bit, so for me, when I did this just a couple of weeks ago with a group, physical is the one I'm not as active as I used to be. I'm not as, looking after my health and well-being. So then if I have that, then I know, okay, that's the area that I need to add something. I need to stretch a little bit so that I'm doing better. I'm more in balance. So that's another tool for self-care. It's important to have difficult conversations, but have them in a way that doesn't look like this, right? Have them in a way. When we're entering some of those difficult conversations, remember what I talked about the brain, right? If we're in a place of the captain, we're going to do better. And most of the time when we're having difficult conversations, we're not in that space. Most of the time, we're in this space. And so I would challenge you, for the people in your household, when you find yourself in conflict, ask yourself, how old am I right now? Am I behaving like a 3-year-old? Am I behaving like an angry teenager? How old am I right now? Especially for those of us who have children ourselves, sometimes, our kids can make us regress. Suddenly, like, I'm fighting with the 7-year-old as if I'm a 7-year-old. So when we're having those difficult conversations, to be really self-reflective and make sure that it's the grown-up speaking and not the angry little child that's inside. Really, really important. And the final tool that I have before our questions is something that I call the God box. And so the God box is a place to put the things that are just too big for you, that are just too big for you. And I mean, you can replace that word God with whatever word you want to use. You can call it, the magic box or whatever, but I learned it as the God box, and it's a place, a physical place. So what we do is, in my family, is we have these little piece of paper, and you write down the thing that's just too big for you. So A few years ago, we put the name of the US president in that box because it was just too big for us. And we're thinking about it all the time. We're talking about it and there's nothing we could do. So we wrote it down, you put it in the God box. And the idea is that you put it in someone else's hands. You put it in someone else's hands. There's things that you and I are not going to be able to solve alone, right? And there's some of us who are really big-hearted that want to solve all the world's problems, and those things actually become like weights on our shoulders. And so this is a place where you can put things to know, yes, these things are important to me. They're meaningful. I want to do something, but I can't do it all. And so you write it down, put it in the God box. So what we do in our family is on New Year's Eve every year, we open up the God box and we see what's in there. And some of the things have just been solved because of the passage of time, right? Some of the things are not still solved and probably won't be solved in our lifetime. So we put those ones back in. But it's a way as a family that we can say that there's some things that are out of our control that we do care about, but we know our individual actions aren't going to solve the whole problem. We'll do our part. And so that's the last tool. So just kind of refreshing you on the tools. I'm just going to go back here so that you remember. So caring, right, with connection, authenticity, responsiveness, and excellence. Setting your boundaries, the balance wheel, and this will be recorded so you can have this to have later. Being willing to have difficult conversations as an adult, and finally the God box. So those are my thoughts around burnout during this time as professionals and some of the things that we might be able to do about it. I see that there's a couple of questions that have come in Q&A. So should we just go to that?
Yeah. So I think whoever had sent this question in has left, but hopefully they will watch this back. The question is, I have a question about the second solution, which is expanding capacity. Mm-hmm. When resources aren't available for that expansion, what are the solutions?
Okay. So when we're talking about expanding capacity, it could mean something like bringing in another person, right? Which could cost money or whatever. I would go even more simple than that. So when we're talking about expanding capacity, it can be the way in which you frame your own, okay, how do I say it? Let me give you an example. Okay, so my kids are schooling from home, right now, like a lot of people's kids. And it sucks. And I don't have the capacity for that because I have a job and I'm trying to work at my job, right? And so one of the things that I had to do to kind of expand my container, right, is set up a time every day where they talk to their nanny, their grandparent, my parents. So every day at a certain time for 20 minutes, they talk to their grandparents over the phone or Zoom or whatever. And I have 20 minutes of free time without them on my head. Right? So that's a way that I've expanded my container, I've expanded my capacity. I'm not doing anything, I'm not hiring someone, but I'm using the resources that I already have and seeing how I can be creative with them. The other thing is, so that's expanding the resources outside of ourselves. What's more important for me is expanding the resources within myself. And so one of the ways we do that is our self-care, right? So going for those walks outside, spending a little bit of time every day chatting with someone who you're not going to stress you out, who's actually funny, watching some comedy, eating right? All of these things to make sure that we're expanded as possible. So that's what I would say about that, you can't always have the financial resources to do it, but there's other ways of expanding your container. Meditation for a lot of people is really, really helpful in just being able to, be still for a period of time so that you can face all those stressors and not be so reactive throughout the day. So those are some other examples of how one might expand their container.
I have a question, Dr. Saira, before I forget, because I didn't type it in there. I really resonate with a lot of what you're saying because I do a lot of spiritual work myself. And with that comes setting healthy boundaries when it comes to professional life and personal life. Mm-hmm. When I'm talking to colleagues, older or younger students, I find that a lot of people have a very difficult time setting those boundaries, especially in a professional capacity, because of the fears and because of maybe either the actual lack of understanding from a superior or the perception that that's what it's going to be just because of stereotypes, bias, whatever. Do you have any advice on how maybe people could tune their mind in a professional capacity to set those boundaries without feeling maybe fearful of doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I understand the fearfulness, right? Because there are some scenarios in which if you were to set the boundary, you might lose your job. So I get that for some people, it's a very real thing. My husband and I talk about this a lot where it's like, but then do I want that job that's going to make me stretch in that way for years and years and years and then have a heart attack at 50 and drop dead? Like, is that what the kind of job I want? And so we might feel afraid, but courage is not about not feeling afraid. Courage is about feeling the fear and just doing it anyway, right? And so I think there needs to be a change in general in the way that we work. And the only way that change happens is when enough people speak up and say, you know what, this is too much. I don't have quality of life when I'm sitting, doing this work for 60 hours a week. I don't have a quality of life because I'm actually like not available for the people who really matter to me. So I would say that you might still be afraid, but you want to really look. I'm actually just did on Thursday, one of my video blogs that's coming out is about change, right? And how do you actually make change? And one of the things about it is to be willing to grieve the things that you're going to lose when you set those boundaries, right? And really kind of weigh that out. So it's not easy to say no. And some people won't like it. Some people will actively dislike it, especially if you're a person who's always said yes. Suddenly you start saying no and people are not going to like that. But if they really care for you, then eventually they'll come around or they'll fade out of your life, which can also happen.
Okay, we have another question. That was really helpful. Thank you. We have another question. I would be grateful if you would talk a bit more about the balance wheel. What are some of the things we should think about under each heading?
Great question. Okay, so I've just brought it up back on my screen here, the balance wheel. So I'll tell you where it comes from. So in transpersonal psychology, these are the 6 pillars. So when I went through my training program, every single class I took, I had to, for my final, as part of the final paper in my master's and PhD, was to actually write how this course impacted me in these 6 areas. And if it didn't impact me in these 6 areas, then I wouldn't pass the class. So everything we were doing was about an integrated life, right? So if I'm learning about, I don't know, if I'm learning about statistics, oh my gosh, that statistics class. Well, then how am I managing my stress of the statistics class? Well, one of the ways I was doing that was I was doing yoga, right? Just to like not get so frazzled. And so that's how physical linked to my statistics class. Right? And so this is, when you think of the balance wheel, it's about all of these areas should be part of all of our lives. And some of us are stronger in some areas than the other, right? Some of us are really good at the intellectual side, but maybe not so creative. And so, but when we pay attention to our creative side, it affects every other area. And creative, people say, I'm not an artist. No, you don't need to be an artist, but you wear clothes every day. You could be creative with that. Right? You cook a meal every day. You could be creative with that. There's lots of ways to be creative that aren't about putting a picture up in a gallery, right? So thinking about how to build that in. Community is the one that's missing for a lot of us right now, because community is not just community on a screen. We actually need physical people, and I kind of talked about that at the beginning. And so as we're starting to open up and whatever, to be really thoughtful about how you're going to strengthen your community piece of the pie. And I think for a lot of people, what we've realized is that we were spending a lot of time with people who we didn't really like that much. And so now we can be more selective in who we include, right, in our actual bubble of 10 people, whatever it is. So yeah, each of those. So community, creative, spiritual is again, it's whatever that means to you in particular. So for some people, that's their religion. For some people, that's not. Whatever it is that puts you in touch with something that's higher and what we call like the mystical unseen, right? That other dimension of human life that's beyond the 5 senses. And so whether that's reading books about spirituality, whether that's some sort of spiritual practice, whatever that is for people. Intellectual can be around learning. One of the things that we know from the millennials and beyond is that lifelong learner mindset is essential if we're going to have any sort of success in any of our careers in any field. And so always being willing to learn, it can be in your field or in something else that you're interested in, but constantly being able to learn. Emotional is, what does your EQ look like? We might know what your IQ looks like, but how good are you at acknowledging your feelings and knowing what to do about them, noticing feelings in other people and knowing what to do about them? And there's lots of like courses and workshops, and therapy is a great way to increase your EQ. And then physical is the obvious, right? Making sure that your body's moving, you're eating right, you're sleeping right, and all of that. So hopefully that answers a little bit more detail into that. I could talk about this. I've done like entire workshops just on this, so I probably need to stop myself there.
Okay, so another question. In terms of empathy on both the giving and receiving side, how do you recommend dealing with someone or myself when they/me go on and on about something and don't do anything to help or change the situation if that is an option? I have found when I am the one doing it, the people around me have a hard time not trying to fix it or getting frustrated with me. I resonate with that. Yeah, I think that's very common, especially when you're already dealing with all this burnout and your own problems in isolation, and then you have to deal with it on an empath level with everybody around you.
Yes. So my sister has this term. It's called ask holes. Like people who ask and ask and ask, but they don't actually take your advice and do anything about it. So first of all, ask yourself, are they an asshole? Like, are they actually asking you because they want your input, or do they just need to vent? Sometimes we just need to vent. And if somebody's venting, one of the things that we can do is kind of, again, a bit of a spiritual concept is you can actually imagine yourself surrounded by a bubble of golden light. So somebody's talking at you and giving you all their problems. You surround yourself with a bubble of golden light and just let those problems just kind of gently bounce off. For those of us who are empathic, it's hard not to take on other people's pain. And so this is a strategy to, like they can tell you, you can be there with them, you can hold it for them, but you don't have to swallow it. You don't have to absorb it in that same way because especially in the professions that we're in, you'll burn out. Like it's too much, right? If you're finding yourself doing that, going on and on and on and not changing anything, then that might be a time to do some soul searching, whether that's through journaling, whether that's through seeing a therapist, right? And looking at like, why do I keep telling this story? What is it in this story that's actually benefiting me? Because if you're not making changes, it's because there's something that you're getting out of it. It might be something hidden, but to ask yourself the question of what am I secretly getting out of this problem? And then when you figure that out, then you're going to be able to dissolve, the barriers and move forward.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes with the boundary setting. And I teach a lot of that in like the spiritual work I do as an intuitive empath is, it's everything around you. You want everything around you to change rather than the situation, which is like we can only control ourselves, as you're saying, and what we allow in and out of our lives. I wanted to ask something. Do you have any tips? I mean, you could probably talk about it all day, as you were saying, before we wrap up, about just like an in-the-moment thing. Of course, meditation is something. I use that a lot. But if people aren't into that or are not comfortable with meditation, if they're just feeling really burnt out in a moment or had a really stressful day, to kind of like, what would you recommend to get back on track in maybe like the quickest way possible?
Listen to music. That's the quickest thing you can do is listen to something so two things. One is either you listen to something that is the way you want to feel, right? So if you're down and you want to feel up, then you listen to something up or 2 or 3 songs. Or something that's going to deepen your feeling. Both work. So when you're sad, you listen to something sadder, which lets you cry it out, or you watch something that's sadder. I give this advice to my clients all the time. When you're picking your television shows, pick things that will be emotive, that will make you really angry or really sad or make you laugh really hard, because it's a place to put those feelings, to get it out. Burnout also happens because we push down our feelings for too long, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. So, television, music, these are ways that we can kind of release some of those emotions in a really quick way.
I don't think we have any more questions, but this was immensely helpful. I'm so excited that it's recorded and that we can share it on the website and our LinkedIn profiles once it's up. Thank you again so much on behalf of the attendees and SAPA BC. And I will definitely be in contact, and the board will be in contact with you. And we really appreciate your time in doing this pro bono during such a crazy pandemic and quarantine situation. So yeah.
And also, just in closing, I want to just make a little plug. If anybody wants more of this kind of content, it's all on my YouTube channel, Dragonfly Wellness TV. So check it out, subscribe. That'll really support me. Dragonfly Wellness TV, and I'm putting out videos all the time. So if you like some of this content, give me a like.
Oh yeah, and I was going to ask before people sign off, if they want to book a session with you, should they go through, is there like a link under there, a specific website for them to go through?
So yeah, so it's dragonflywellnesscenter.ca. You could just Google Saira Sabzaali. You'll find me. I'm all over the internet. And yeah, I'm on Psychology Today. I'm everywhere. So Saira Sabzaali or Dr. Saira, you'll find me. And I am taking on clients right now. And I'm also offering free check-in calls. So if you just need to talk for 10 or 15 minutes just to get a load off, I'm offering that until the middle of July. So you can book that in and just have a listening ear.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saira.
You're welcome. Bye.